I'm Rick Owen. You may know me. I'm an organizer of QED. If you've been before, you may have seen me around doing the odd panel. I'm obviously not an expert on UFOs, so I've co-opted two of them to help me. UFOs have been going through a sort of rebranding recently, haven't they? So I think going way back to the Second World War when fighter pilots were reporting Foo Fighters, and then in the 1950s, they coined the term flying saucers. It's a nice term, but it's fallen out of favour because I think you have to have a theremin playing when you use the word. It's a bit awkward. I grew up calling them UFOs. I suppose, therefore, it's my favourite term, in the same way that Tom Baker would be my favourite Doctor Who. But nowadays, I think the term of art preferred is UAP, which stands for either, I've heard, unidentified aerial phenomena or unidentified anomalous phenomena.
The second one, according to US Congress.
And NASA say that as well. Yeah. Now, I've got some thoughts about this, obviously. I embrace change. I love it. Nice. But UFOs gave us ufology, right? And UAPs can only give us U-apology. I don't know what it is. I think a U-apology is one of those apologies where you go, I'm sorry you found that offensive. It is an apology, but it's their fault still. So we can't use it that way, can we? The other thing about UAP is why use an initialism when you have the phrase anomalous phenomena? I mean, it's poetry, it's found art. I mean, just use the whole word, it's great. Enough of my nonsense, though. Let me allow my panelists to introduce themselves. If we were on a daytime talk show, the title appearing underneath their names doubtless would be ufologist, and not a U-apologist. So let's start with Andrew, perhaps on my left.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Robinson. I'm a photographer, senior lecturer in photography at Sheffield Hallam University, where I work alongside David in the Centre for Contemporary Legend. I'm not a ufologist. I kind of got
that
involved.
Wouldn't matter on daytime TV, you know.
I got involved in this story, a year and a half ago, I guess. But I have had a long-standing interest in folklore and custom, and I've been documenting English and British folk custom for about 25 years.
And David?
Yeah, where do I start with this? I got, in fact, advance plug. If you watch Netflix, beginning next Wednesday, there's a new series called Steven Spielberg's Encounters, which is 4 different programs traveling around the world, visiting various places that have got a UFO legend, and I'm sort of narrating one of them. So if you miss anything during this presentation, check me out on Netflix next week. I think it'll be a really good series because they've spent a lot of money on it. Yeah, so I got involved in UFOs when I saw a group of kids in Wales on John Craven's Newsround in 1977, and I was 10 years old, and ever since then I've been on the sort of UFO beat as a journalist, folklorist, and now I'm associate professor at Sheffield Hallam University, co-founded the Contemporary Legend Centre, so we actually get sort of paid for doing this kind of thing and being sceptical at the same time.
Right. So I think what you have for us here is a sort of case study. Is that a fair description?
Yes.
Well, so do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so we thought rather than sort of going in and talking about NASA and all the usual sorts of problems that come with UFO evidence and what constitutes evidence, we'd talk about this case study which we've been working on for the last, well, I've been working on it for about 13 years, on and off, and it's all to do with a photograph. And I think we'll all agree, if there are such things as UFOs and flying saucers, you know, photographic evidence is sort of one of the things that we should be looking at. I mean, certainly there's the grainy US Navy images that you've probably all seen online as declared as proof that we are being visited, and that what else could it be other than aliens?
And just a note, that's why we've got these screens switched on, and for the people who are in the other rooms, we've provided some printouts, so because it is important to look at the photographs. So just a note for the people who we can't see here, that they have a set of photographs that should help explain what we're going to talk about.
So we're calling this the Calvine UFO photograph. You've probably never heard of Calvine. It's a small hamlet consisting of one house and a garage, 30 miles. You'll all have probably heard of Pitlochry in the Scottish Highlands, and this has been actually described as an aerial Loch Ness monster because of its location. just to set the scene. So what we're going to do here, we're going to look at the competing narratives that have grown up around this iconic image that apparently shows a huge UFO hovering above a Scottish glen. And as you can see, it's been buzzed by what looks like a military jet immediately to the bottom right. Now, what's interesting about this image is that, unlike many other UFO legends, this story first emerged not as a story about a sighting or an experience, but a story about a photograph of a sighting or experience, because until the summer of last year, no one had actually seen the photograph. All we had was just stories about other people who had seen this photograph. It's actually one of a series of 6 on a strip of negatives that once existed. So there is no narrator, there's only a photograph, and all that existed before 2009, as I say, was a story about someone who had taken a stunning photograph that no one had ever seen. This is what we find really interesting about this. So the Calvine photo that you can see here is believed to be one of 6 taken at this hamlet near Pitlochry in 1990. And it was completely unknown, the story, until 1996, when this incident was first mentioned in a book by a former Ministry of Defence UFO desk officer called Nick Pope. Now, I'm sure there's none of you that probably have not heard of Nick Pope. Hands up if you even don't know who Nick Pope is. Ooh, wow.
Maybe a quick brief.
He'll be absolutely devastated.
He's a former MOD desk officer.
Yeah, he used to work for the Ministry of Defence during the 1990s, and you probably heard that the Ministry of Defence used to have a little desk that investigated UFO stories, and he was the desk officer for a period of 3 years. He then defected from being an official skeptic to becoming a believer. He wrote a book called Open Skies, Closed Minds. He left the MOD and he's now become a UFO celebrity who tours America talking about his time running the British UFO Ministry of Defence project.
He described himself as a whistleblower.
Whistleblower.
But he didn't actually investigate the UFOs. The information passed his desk, passed over his desk.
So his story that's in the book is that when he went for the interview for the job as UFO desk officer, the previous chap that was doing this, called Owen Hartop, showed him into the office, and the first thing he saw on the wall was a massive poster of that image pinned to the wall, which looked pretty impressive to him. And he was told, oh, this is an incident that had happened during, I think it was the summer of 1990, when these 2 guys had been out walking on the moors in Scotland, and they'd seen this enormous object hovering in the sky, completely silent. And as they were watching it, they heard this jet coming down the valley, and it passed below the object, circled around it as if the pilot had seen the object, disappeared, and then the thing went straight up into the sky, completely soundless. All this time they're snapping away on a little sort of portable camera. We don't know quite what the camera was. And that was the photo. But at that point, as I've said, no one had actually seen the photographs other than Nick Pope. So he's been sort of making a living out of telling this story and about how his boss had taken the photograph down at some stage, because all this happened in just before the outbreak of the first Gulf War, when there was massive military movements going on. The Americans were using the F-117, the stealth fighter, in the attack on Baghdad that began early in 1991. So his boss thought, this is some kind of super secret American experimental aircraft that's been photographed, and we don't want to upset the Americans, so we won't release the photographs. Okay, so this got into Nick Pope's book, and it just became one of these UFO legends that people keep repeating, that gets on the internet, etc., etc. So I then, as a result of my interest in this subject and all the research I was doing at the National Archives said the Ministry of Defence have decided to release all their archives to the public, and we're scanning thousands and thousands of pages of these files. Would you like the gig to sort of be our spokesperson and actually, you know, curate all this stuff, and we're going to release it to the public? And we did 10 separate releases. You may remember it was in all the media at the time. Now, I was waiting for the files from 1990 to come along as part of this program to see what was in there. And when those files arrived and I looked through them, lo and behold, that was the Calvine image. And I just thought, oh, that's a bit rubbish, isn't it, compared to what... But that's what was in the paperwork. But that is actually, as you can see, if you compare it to this, it's a very poor photo. Somebody's photocopied it and just sort of cut the image out. And they apparently sent it to an agency called JARIC, who are the Joint Air Intelligence Reconnaissance Office, who are the people who analysed all the sorts of photographs that were sent in by RAF pilots during the Second World War. So they are the RAF's top guns in terms of like photo analysis. And apparently they were not able to identify the diamond-shaped object. And neither, bizarrely, you'd think the RAF would know where all their jets were. At the time and place, there were no Harriers, which is what that was identified as, the small aircraft, flying. So that's in the files that were released in 2009, and then nothing else. Almost as if the file comes to an end, someone removes any further correspondence about it, and it just disappears from the paperwork. As a journalist, I thought, this is interesting. What's going on here? And the interesting thing was the files, there's a brief into Margaret Thatcher, to her defence minister, saying, oh my God, these photographs have been sent to us. We can't identify what the object is. And the two lads who've taken it have taken all these photographs and negatives to the Scottish Daily Record newspaper in Glasgow, who are going to run it as an exclusive. We need to brief the ministers to answer questions from the media when this story breaks. The bizarre thing was the Daily Record never ran the story. The photographs never appeared. And we now know that the local RAF press officer was asked to contact the newspaper and arrange to have the negatives sent from the newspaper to the Ministry of Defence, at which point they vanished. Now, why a newspaper, this is me as a journalist, would hand over material like that was copyrighted as well and allow the government to sort of make it disappear and never run the story, I find is the most baffling part of the whole thing. It's almost X-Files, isn't it? It is like the X-Files, and the bizarre thing is the X-Files was on telly at the time, so there's sort of a bit of a crossover here. Now that's where it was left, and no one could progress the story, even though Nick Pope kept dripping it into the News of the World and various other tabloids. And I'd sort of given up on it because I phoned the Daily Record. All the people who worked there in 1990 had either drunk themselves to death or they were no longer around. Literally, this is newspapers. People live hard, and there's very few people from 1990, amazingly, still alive. I worked on a newspaper at the time, and I've got friends who I can contact who were around from 1990. But bizarrely, from this, we couldn't get anywhere. So I did a bit of investigative journalism, and I tracked down the person who was the RAF press officer for Scotland at the time. And I phoned him up out of the blue, this was about 2 years ago, and said, hello, I'm David Clark from Sheffield Hallam University. And before I could say anything, he said, I know what you're ringing about. I said, how do you know? I've never phoned you before. And he said, you're phoning about those photographs, aren't you? And he said, I've been waiting for 32 years for someone to call me about this story. And it emerged that he'd been sent an original print by the Daily Record at the time, and he popped it in his desk drawer when he retired. So he said, would you like to come up and I'll hand over the print. In fact, I'll give it to your university for your archive if you want, because I've been sitting on it for all these years. So I went to Scotland. He gave me the photograph. I wrote a piece for the Daily Mail, which is apparently the most read story on Mail Online last August, when it was published. So that's my bit. And over to you, Andrew. So obviously, my colleague who's a photography expert, I wanted Andrew to immediately look at the photo and tell me what you could find.
David asked me if I would come into, it's in the summer holidays, this more or less, so come in, you've got to come in. I'm coming back from Scotland. I'm going to bring the print in. I want you to photograph this print. I didn't really know what it was at first. And then I'm going to put it in the archive. I don't want to take it home. It's, it's really valuable. So I went in wondering what this was. And we scanned the print and photographed it as well. And during that process, I was kind of saying, oh, it's interesting. It's on colour paper, but it's a black and white image. And there's this, it's the grain and all that. And I started to discuss it with you. And you said, could you write that up? And I ended up writing like an 8 or a 9 page analysis of the photograph. And kind of to summarise, let me get on to the next page. So I kind of looked at the background, looked at the paper, wrote this up, and then David incorporated quite a bit of this information in the article that he wrote for the Daily Mail. And just to kind of really briefly summarise the findings, it's the print that David got from Craig is actually a colour print but it's from a black and white negative.
We should say Craig. It's Craig Lindsay, who's
Craig
the
Lindsay,
press officer.
the press officer. So that's interesting in the first place. It looks, to all purposes, you can't say it is, but it looks like it's taken on a 35mm SLR or a compact camera. It looks like it's taken on 35mm film, but we don't have the negative, so we can't say that. And as far as I'm concerned, you can't see any signs of manipulation of either the negative or the print. And if you enlarge it, if this was a cut and paste of an image and then a rephotograph it, so one way of faking it would be to cut and paste something onto a photograph of that view of the Highlands and then rephotograph it, you would see some evidence around that. And there's no, the grain travels evenly across the boundary. The unidentified object is fairly sharp, but the Harrier shows movement blur. The weather conditions you can see in the photograph are consistent with the Met records for that day. Okay. And basically everything I could find supports the claimed heritage of the print. And the easiest way to create such an image, you know, if you were trying to fake this, if you were trying to create this in front of the camera, and I believe this was photographed, something's been photographed here in front of the camera, would be to do what other UFO photographs did, which is kind of cut out flying saucers, stick them on a piece of glass and hold it. It's what in cinematography, in movies, you call a matte painting. You put them on a piece of glass, hold it in front of the camera. But it's fairly easy to recognize that, because what you get in these two famous examples is the background's nice and sharp, but these objects that are flying in the sky are out of focus, but they're not showing movement blur. They're just out of focus because they're closer to the camera and they're not further. The way depth of field works in photographs, they're not further away, they're closer to the camera. So, and in fact, the picture on the right, the person who took the photograph has admitted that they were put on glass.
Yes, yeah. Well, he admitted it initially, and then he's gone back and said it wasn't.
Yeah,
changed the story.
And then the other way of doing that would be to have something actually in the scene, which is how this photograph was probably constructed, hanging from the telegraph wire or hanging on fishing wire, an object there. Maybe.
I mean, that one is supposed to show a wing mirror from a Model T Ford. That's hanging from a fishing line.
You can almost imagine the fishing line in this photograph, although actually when you look at it, it's not there. But again, that could be how this has been created. Nevertheless, there's something it's really hard to scientifically analyze and prove, but just my instincts from looking at that as a photograph is it really looks like it's in that space, kind of between the trees and the fence in the foreground and the Harrier and the vague sketch of the hill line in the background. So where are we now? So it's your turn, David.
Well, I should say, just talking about the photograph, that image is the one that apparently the picture desk editor at the Scottish Daily Record sent to Craig Lindsay when Craig said, could you send me the best shot from the 6? Because the other 6 apparently show a sequence of just the object, then the Harrier coming in, manoeuvring around it, down the other side of it, and then disappearing off. Now, if this was a hoax like those other photos from the 1960s that Andrew's talked about, that would be a much more difficult hoax to pull off on a strip of negatives with other images on the other side as well.
You're going to talk about the impact.
Yeah, so the impact. So we did this. We haven't. No one knows where the negatives are. So obviously we'd like to find where the remaining prints are as well. In August 2022, the story, when I did this piece in the Daily Mail newspaper, for a 24-hour period following the release of the photograph, Calvin UFO hashtag was trending on Twitter, and in fact, it got more coverage than the knife attack on Salman Rushdie that happened on the same day. So there was all these people weighing in online immediately, all coming up with weird and wonderful explanations as to what was shown in the photograph. So, Andrew, back to you.
Okay.
That's the story, yeah.
I mean, there were so many online interpretations of the photograph trying to explain it. I can only just mention a few, but one idea was that the photograph had been inverted, that it's actually a rock in a lake, and the picture has been turned upside down, and this is someone's sort of 3D computer drawing, sort of demonstrating how that would look.
So the Harrier is not a Harrier; it's a man in a boat who's rowing.
Oh, that was one. That was one. Some people said that it's a rock. The picture was taken this way up, and this is a rock with a reflection, and that's a reflection of an actual plane in the sky.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, there's just something that's not right in that. The angles and everything don't quite fit. It was also suggested that it was a kite, and there was a suggestion that the shape of the object is actually very similar to the shape of one of the hills in the background, and it was suggested that it was a cloud inversion, and people went into lots of explanations. There's no way you could get a cloud inversion at that kind of altitude with that kind of valley in that way. But nevertheless, this was all circulating on social media. I need to turn the page, because Belgian skeptic Wim van Utrecht suggested that it was actually a Christmas decoration, and he found one online, bought it, took it home, and hung it up. And actually, this was one of, I think, the most credible sort of attempts to recreate the picture, because it does look, from that angle, very similar to the photograph. So all this was kind of happening online. Some people suggested digital manipulation, but at the time, Photoshop was available, but not to the general public, and it couldn't do this kind of manipulation.
So the Wim van Utrecht theory, I just think is absolutely ingenious, because if you accept that that's what happened, then you've got the Christmas decoration suspended from the tree that you can see at the top, and then how do you get the Harrier? And how do you get the Harrier to move around? Well, apparently they got a fishing rod with a little model Harrier and doing this around it and then snapping away. Possible, I suppose. You know.
Yeah.
But then the probably the most plausible explanation, if it is something in front of the camera, genuinely there, is that it's some form of secret military aircraft. And as David mentioned, the incident took place just after the invasion, the first Gulf War, and
in fact, it happened 2 days after Saddam Hussein forces invaded Kuwait. And there was American special forces based at RAF Makri Hanish, which is not far from where Paul McCartney's farm is, on the Mull of Kintyre. And there were lots of rumours in the Scottish newspapers at the time that the Americans were flying some kind of stealth aircraft, experimental aircraft that was nicknamed the Aurora. And this had been picked up on radar, travelling at some tremendous speed. So interesting that all that happened. And there was another guy that came forward who was working on an oil rig, who was an aircraft identification officer with the Royal Observer Corps, and he'd seen an object very similar to that triangle flying over the North Sea, being escorted by F-117s and a big, huge KC-135 tanker around the same time. So all of this, to me, looking at it, unlike a lot of other UFO stories where you just never get to the bottom of it, to me this is clearly can only have one of two explanations. Either it's a hoax of the type that Andrew just described. You know, maybe somebody went to some elaborate way to create this photograph, took it to the newspaper. The newspaper then gave the images to the Ministry of Defence. Suddenly they thought, oh my God, we've really been dropped in it now. And they started getting questioned by these spooks who turned up, and they confessed it was a hoax, but then they just said, oh, we'll keep it quiet. You know, we won't embarrass you by sort of revealing this publicly. So it could be a hoax. The only other explanation I can see is that it was a genuine photograph of some top secret aircraft that the Americans were flying over Scotland at the time. And strangely enough, by a complete coincidence, I phoned someone during my investigations who used to work for British intelligence on this subject, and I didn't phone him to ask him about this photograph. I just phoned him to do a general interview about what his duties were. And halfway through the conversation, and you've heard this conversation, Andrew, I just say, was there any particular incident during your 15 years as UFO investigation for Ministry of Defence that a case that really intrigued you that you couldn't explain? And he said, yeah, there was that time. There was two lads in Scotland who were out. He said they were poaching deer. And that's why they didn't want to be identified. And he said they were posing with their kill when this thing appeared in the background, and they snapped away, took these photographs. And he said it caused an enormous meltdown with the Americans because they thought this thing was invisible. And these two lads had photographed it. when they shouldn't have photographed it. So we had to make it go away. They were his words.
I mean, what was fascinating about the way this developed online after David's story was produced is it was kind of like a speeded up version of the creation of legend and storytelling and narratives, all based on this one photograph. So I've got just a little bit to say about photography and narrative, photography and evidence and narrative. This is actually a portrait by David Hockney. It is. I don't know if it's his stickman face. When Hockney was interested in joiners, and what Hockney points out is that we don't see the way a camera sees. We've got two eyes, we look around, we build a picture over time. And that's what his joiners were all about exploring. And photographs don't see in that way. And as David said, if we had all 6 of the images and they're on a continuous strip of film, it would be very, very hard to fake that, dangling things from trees. And apparently the 5 photographs exist. But we need to know what came before and what came after. The photograph provides loads and loads of visual detail, but without the context in which it's taken, we can't really understand what's happening there. So we need to know what came before and after. It'd be really useful to know what camera it was taken on, because then you've got the focal length of the lens, you know the depth of field, you know the angle of view, you can make detailed calculations, but we don't know that. It probably is a cheap SLR, an SLR like the Olympus you can see up there, or these compact cameras which were very popular in the early 90s. We need to know who took the picture.
Yes, now this is where I should interject that on the back of the original print is written in red ink, copyright Kevin Russell, care of Daily Record, Glasgow. Now we spent ages. We have traced every single person born in the UK called Kevin Russell who could have been at the sort of age that he was at that particular time. We've traced them all, we've written to them all, contacted them all. Not a single one of them has said, that's me. But strangely enough, one of the Kevin Russells that we found works for the same RAF photo analyst organisation who did the analysis of the photographs in the first place. And I contacted him on LinkedIn and said, is this your photograph? And he responded straight away saying, I have no recollection of being in Scotland in 1990.
Which is a politician's answer, isn't it? I have no recollection. And what's the best thing to do with someone who's faked such a wonderful photograph? Get them in-house, isn't it? Anyway, and the other thing that would be useful is to know where it's taken. And people have been out trying to find the location, but not yet been able to find the exact location. But this is the same landscape that the photograph was in. It's just about where that position is. But we also kind of need to know where the negatives, where the photographs went. Why is it on colour film? Sorry, colour. Why is it colour print when it's a black and white neg? Is it a copy neg? Did they make a copy neg? And did the Daily Record keep the negs, which you would expect them to do? So we need to know the heritage of the imagery, and all of this is lacking. And you've got to come back to the fact that photographs only contain the seeds of narratives, and the narratives come to fruition in our minds or in the minds of the viewer. So that is a form of narrative time, the reading of a photograph. But even though we know that photography can be faked, perhaps more so than ever before with the idea of deep fake, and there's been so many examples in recent years, we still kind of believe them. Looking at the presentations today, how many people are supporting their arguments with photographic images? They're seductive, aren't they? So I think that's... Oh, yeah. So Nick Pope, as David said, has been making a living out of drip feeding this privileged information. And so this is where you get these YouTube and online celebrities making a living and building a reputation out of their sort of inside knowledge.
But what I should say there in support of Nick Pope, you know, I told the story about him seeing the poster on the wall when he went for the interview. Interestingly enough, when I interviewed Craig Lindsay, after he'd sent the negatives to the Ministry of Defence and heard nothing, he expected the story to be all over the papers. A few months later, he went down to the Ministry of Defence headquarters for his monthly briefing and thought, oh, I'll pop upstairs to the UFO office and see what they know, what they've done with these pictures. And you know what's coming next? He opened the door. On the wall was a huge poster of the photo of the best print that he'd sent earlier in the year. So, and he was basically told, yeah, we've looked at it and our best chaps are investigating it. We haven't been able to explain it. Leave it to London. That's what they said, and he heard nothing else for another 32 years until I phoned him up. But it just struck me as like, if you've seen the film Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, when they get the Ark back at the end, and there's that thing where they're pushing it into the huge warehouse, you know, and Indiana Jones are saying, well, who's looking at this? And he said, don't worry, we've got our best chaps on it. Again, it's like life imitating art, isn't it?
And so we're kind of getting to the end of what we've been talking about. Yes, Professor, who isn't a Professor, Simon Holland, is constantly putting videos on YouTube and has done quite a lot of and his point of view fluctuates backwards and forwards on what the Calvin photo is. And this is all to do with this idea of having privileged information that gives you credibility. The quote there, I've seen all 6 pictures, is there's a freelance photographer called Stu Little who apparently went into the Daily Record and saw the negatives. He was given the negatives to look at on a light box with a magnifier and saw all 6 negatives. But the problem is his information is kind of tainted because he's got his own channel about UFOs on YouTube and he's kind of involved. And then we come to NASA. And what's really interesting about NASA's report that was released last week is what they're trying to do is kind of address all of the issues that have coming out in our discussion here
evidence.
About getting evidence. Well, there aims to address inappropriate and uncalibrated sensors, the lack of contextual metadata, the problem with archiving, and the stigma that's attached to this subject. So that is their aim. I mean, it's amazing that NASA's got involved in this, really, isn't it? But I think that's the end of our presentation.
So there's no conclusion to this, but I think this story encapsulates all the problems that NASA are currently grappling with.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're saying they're not going to look at historical cases because how can you investigate things that happened 30 years ago where all the key evidence has either been lost or destroyed, which is similar to the situation we've got here.
Yeah. UFOs, I mean, it's not unique. I think there are several phenomena like this seem to be a thing that exists almost entirely in the realm of photography and video footage as well. I mean,
and drawings.
Drawings,
Book of drawings.
Oh yes, let me plug my book. So the National Archives UFO book that I did for.
But what is interesting about Dave's book is that these are drawings made by people who claim to have witnessed UFOs, and they're fascinating in themselves. The way people draw them and the way that they draw them at different points in history,
even.
Paintings, drawings, and where's that?
That's a watercolor.
I mean, there's kids' ones here, but they're from a cross section. Oh, some of them are. Look at this one. So it's got this
Thunderbird 3. 2.
I mean, it would be really interesting to link them to sort of contemporary culture at the time that they're drawn and written.
I mean, that's a great example of
table.
That represents eyewitness testimony, doesn't it? Someone drawing what they saw or telling you what they saw, and yet it is still the photographs that, as you say, with all of the different flaws that they may have as evidence, that really capture the imagination. And your story starts with people having an eyewitness account of having seen a photograph of a UFO.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, this is a pre-digital photograph. And like one of the things that NASA is saying is everybody's got fantastic smartphones now.
Yes.
You know, and we should sort of like do some kind of crowdsourcing thing and get the public, if they see anything odd, send their images to NASA because you've got all the metadata and everything. But it's just such a bloody hell. They didn't have a smartphone, did they? These two lads in Scotland.
What's interesting about this article in the newspaper is that is a reconstruction of the photograph before the photograph was discovered, based on Nick Pope's testimony. So it's Nick Pope's version of one of these.
Drawn this.
Right, and if you ask me, this was produced 20 odd years after Nick Pope had apparently seen the image.
There's a lot.
That's an amazing accuracy. Given there's a 20-year, you're not telling me he hasn't got a copy at home that he's keeping quiet about.
But the interesting thing about this is a lot of people who've seen this online think this is the actual photograph.
Yeah.
Even though it's an artist's impression of it before the actual photograph emerged.
Where's your copy of the photo?
So it's very interesting that there's no record of the military plane or a military plane flying.
Yeah.
Which is the kind of corroborating evidence I think you'd really want to make sense of a photograph like this.
But again, you've got to carefully interpret what the Ministry of Defence say about that, because they're saying none of their Harriers. Well, the Americans were flying naval Harriers from aircraft carriers at the time. So if it was an American experimental aircraft, it was being escorted by one of their Harriers, testing our air defence, see whether we could see it. Because that was the whole point. They were going to send it over Iraq.
But of course, the MOD can say that and tell the truth in saying that. So Thatcher wouldn't be lying to Parliament were she to state that. So
So what's your sense of how governments treat the UFO phenomena in general?
I think they see it as a nuisance. Something they don't want to spend time and money on, but unfortunately when the media and politicians get hold of it, as they have in America at the moment, and somebody's thought there's some tax dollars to be made out of this, which I think is what's going on with NASA. I think they think, you know, if Congress are into UFOs and there's billions of dollars available, then we want some of it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's attracted NASA.
And you get the impression that Nick Pope was the one UFO desk officer who actually was interested in this.
Yeah.
That from your conversations with the others, it was like, not another of these ridiculous reports that I've got to log and deal with.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, Owen Hartop, who was the desk officer when the photograph was taken, just not talking. I'm not interested in talking about it.
What do you think is behind that, though? I mean, for people who, I mean, the idea of a government cover-up hits differently these days to me. I mean, for instance, in the US, can you imagine the United States? It used to be said, didn't it, that if a new president is being sworn in, he gets taken to a room, sat down, and told all about the alien they've got in Area 51. But this is a country who we know keeps their secret documents in the shower room of a golf club.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure they could keep it secret.
No, I'm not sure they could. But there are some things they can keep secret. What intrigues me from a journalistic perspective is how they could stop a newspaper like the Daily Record, with a circulation of 750,000 readers at the time, from publishing a photograph like that, which landed on my desk. I was on the Sheffield Star at the time. That would have been on the front page. I don't care whether it's a fake. It's a good photograph. And they've never been able to explain why they didn't run the story. Also, how do you make someone like this Kevin Russell completely vanish off the face of the earth?
Yeah.
You know, not a single person has come forward, despite massive publicity in Scotland and worldwide, to say, I'm Kevin Russell, or I was Kevin Russell's girlfriend, and I remember him taking this photograph at the time. I just find that baffling.
There are mysteries here, but least of all what they happen to have maybe photographed, I think, in some ways.
I mean, what's interesting about the fact that it's not being explained is it creates this space for narrative, for legend, for kind of this folklore almost to grow up around this incident. Yeah. And it's all around, well, the non-existence of this photograph until it was discovered. And now it's about interpreting or trying to debunk or trying to prove what's in the photograph.
Yeah. And it's been mainly skeptics and debunkers who have been doing that, rather than the people you would normally expect to say, oh, yeah, this is proof of aliens, because I don't think it is it? Something, but...
So are you saying that all the many different theories that skeptics have used to try and explain this have actually fueled the myth-making?
And they're all, what gets me is they're all absolutely certain that their theory is the correct one. Well, they can't all be correct, can they? Because they are mutually contradictory. It can't be both a rock in a pond and an inversion of a mountain top and
a Christmas
thing dangled. One of those has got to be wrong, haven't they? They can't all be right, and yet the skeptics and the people trying to debunk it are all absolutely sure that they've solved it. And every time it turns up on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, there's a mention of the story. There's always someone that says, oh, we're not on about this again. It's a bloody rock in a pond. And it's like, no, it isn't. You haven't demonstrated it's a rock in a pond at all. That's your interpretation. But they are absolutely certain that they've solved it.
I mean, I think the simplest explanation is the most likely, that it's something in the sky that was photographed there and then. What it is, we don't know. But kind of reinterpreting the photograph, nothing quite fits on these alternative explanations.
And even if it isn't the Aurora or a top secret experimental aircraft, why is it not some kind of kite or a blimp of some kind that they were using as a radar target? It could be anything of that kind, some kind of military exercise that these two lads stumbled upon and photographed. That's, to me, one of the simplest explanations.
Weren't they meant to be collecting mushrooms in one of the explanations?
Yes. Yeah, that's one of them.
Don't often affect cameras, though, do they? But I mean, you said there's no conclusion to the story, but the clue is in the name, isn't it? Unidentified.
Yes.
That's the key thing, isn't it? And people jumping to conclusions one way or another, I think, is a sort of dogmatism that we need to avoid.
But Alan Hynek, who was the US Air Force astronomy consultant to their last project, Project Blue Book, when he was talked about UFOs and the word unidentified, and he said, well, unidentified to whom? In a military context.
I wonder whether there are any questions in the audience. Seems like there are. So I need someone, because I'm too lazy, but volunteer maybe, to grab the squidgy mic box, and it can be thrown safely, so I hear, but don't feel you have to. Make sure you speak into it, though. The world is listening.
I was wondering, you said you were interested in UFOs since you were about 10 years old. So I was wondering, how did you keep yourself from becoming a true believer? Or have you ever had, like, sometimes in your life that you felt or thought or that these are real visitations or something like that?
Well, I was a true believer at 10. You know, I mean, I went on from John Craven's Newsround to watch Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, you know, with the revolving skull and all the rest of it. And, you know, I believed 10 impossible things before breakfast at that time. Yeah, but
Me
then
too, yeah.
But then becoming a journalist, I was then actually going out and interviewing people who'd seen these things. And then it got me interested in some of the stories I remembered hearing about when I was 10. And I actually then reinvestigated those and went back and found the people who were involved and realised that the story was completely different to what it was or what I imagined it to be at that time. And I think that's what a lot of people go through a learning curve. If they continue with their interest in it, you find that a lot of them sort of eventually become cynics, you know, because they realise there can't be that number of aliens visiting us. It's just unlikely. In terms of odds, and you know, the evidence just isn't there. It's all about human testimony and effectively folklore, which is my field, you know. And eventually you get to the point of just saying, does it matter whether it's true or false? It's just an interesting story, you know. And why do people tell these stories? What function does it have? And people's entire lives have been changed because they've become obsessed with UFOs or alien abductions. I mean, look at Nick Pope. He's gone from being a dropout, a high school dropout, to being like a media celebrity, touring the world and making a living out of the subject. So, you know, it's important from that perspective. Not really, no, to be honest. He's just one, though, because one of the things we were going to talk about is how the whole subject now is led by these celebrities. And Nick Pope's just one of them. There's a whole bunch of them. Jeremy Corbell, I think it is, in America. There's various people who are sort of running TV programs, YouTube, and making huge amounts of money out of it. And they don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg by talking about all the problems that there is with these with these stories. And hopefully, when NASA eventually finish their investigation and the UFO task force do, they will. I can predict. I'd put money on this that they will reach exactly the same conclusion that Project Blue Book reached in 1969, that, you know, a lot of people see odd things in the sky, but there's an awful lot of things that, you know, cause people to see UFOs. And the one thing I noticed from NASA, I went through their report, not a single mention of any of the previous historical studies that have been done by the American authorities on this subject. It's almost as if none of that ever happened. Project Sign, Project Grudge, Blue Book, the last NASA not investigation, but they were keen to not get dragged into this again when Jimmy Carter tried to get them back on the UFO beat in 1977 because he had his own sighting. You're talking about US presidents, and it turns out he actually saw Venus, but that's over that one. But no one seems to learn from any of the previous. They just keep going on repeating the same mistakes all the time.
Father, what's the source of the tail of the object ascending silently? Because there's a military jet very nearby. Military jets are staggeringly noisy.
Yes.
And how anyone would be able to determine that another vehicle is silent when there's a military jet that close? I have no... Where does that story come from?
Well, that came from the fact that Craig Lindsay, the press photographer, he was given a number for the witness, and he phoned a hotel where this guy was working temporarily as a chef or something. And this is the story that this chap told him, that they'd seen this thing, they'd seen the jet come down the valley, really loud noise, and then when the jet disappeared, the object just went upwards completely silently. But I agree with you. Harriers make a huge...
Yeah, they're very, very noisy. Yeah.
So if this object was some kind of drone, for instance, and he was making a very sort of intermittent noise, you'd probably be drowned out by the sound of the jet anyway, wouldn't it?
I feel this is often just a way of putting us at the centre of the universe again. If there are intelligent aliens out there, they could be doing lots of things. Why would they fly so many light years to come and visit this planet and look at it from a distance, when it's much more likely another explanation is true with Occam's razor? So what are your thoughts on whether it's either putting the person or society as a whole at the real focus of this?
I completely agree with you. Why would they do that? But the very definition of alien is something we don't understand if aliens were involved.
Just a very brief one here.
Speak right into the box, please.
Straight into the box. Okay, so brief one here. As an old Trekkie, I'm reminded of the episode Tomorrow is Yesterday. Captain John Christopher is a USAF pilot sent up to chase an object which is flying around and then disappears up into the sky and disappears at the end of the episode. And that looks very like an old part of the Star Trek. It's part of the Enterprise, minus all the other hanging off bits. And I'm just wondering, you know, the story is so similar. And of course, you're saying that culturally, what's going on in culture is relevant to the whole story of how these things are described. So I can't get that out of my mind as I look at that picture, I'm afraid. So it just looks like someone has rigged it up to look that way somehow.
Yeah, I mean, and what was on TV and in the media at the time is really relevant, because I think it was immediately pre-X-Files. But interestingly, at the time, I don't know whether you remember this, there was that part of Scotland was always in the media, and it was known as the Bonnybridge Triangle. And there was loads of sort of people seeing things around that area between Glasgow and Falkirk. So I do wonder if it's someone who got wrapped up in that, who thought, you know, I'll fake a photograph, you know, to make Bonnybridge like the British equivalent of Roswell and try and get people to sort of visit on pilgrimage, that kind of thing. Maybe.
You spoke about the documentation that was released by the archives. Could there be another batch of documentation that is currently confidential and not published and will be in 10, 20 years be published by the Ministry of Defense or other organizations?
Yes. The thing is, if anyone has had any dealings with Freedom of Information Act, if they've got information that they don't want to release, what they will do is they'll give it to a private agency, such as in this case, if anyone's got any data on this and it is an experimental aircraft, all they had to do was just take the material out of the file, give it to BAE Systems, who, because they're a private company that contract to the Ministry of Defence, they're outside the Freedom of Information Act. So you make an FOI request, you say, could I see the file on this? Sorry, we haven't got it. And they're not lying, because they've given it to BAE Systems. Whether it'll ever get to be released is another matter.
In your piece on The Skeptic, there was a thing about releasing the secret information in 2074 or something. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of, if you go online and you look at the tabloid stories, there's all this stuff about the file on this case being sealed until 2076. That is completely wrong. What it is the name Kevin Russell, which is in one of the original documents, is redacted. And because of the Data Protection Act, they can't release that name, even though we know the name officially, until 2076 under data protection. It's not the actual...
I mean, the things that could turn up is the negatives could turn up. Yeah. I believe that they probably made copy negatives. Yeah. The problem is the Daily Record was working with analogue film, and then they switched to digital, and most newspapers, when they did that, they just trashed all the old film and prints. Yeah. But they could be somewhere. Did they? Or did they? Did they? Well, maybe Nick Pope's got them.
I'm sorry, we are completely out of time, and I get in trouble if I don't stop.
David will sign this very reasonably priced book, £11, folks.
By the way,
in there.
Has anyone seen a UFO? Hands up if you think you've seen a UFO.
Oh, one.
So everyone else thinks they know exactly what everything they've ever seen in the sky is. Thanks very much. A huge round of applause for Andrew and David.